Shalom. We are now continuing our series concerning Ephraim and proving that the British and nations that are offshoots of the British, such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada and other places, represent the tribe of Ephraim. Ephraim and Manasseh were the two sons of Joseph. Eventually, through a series of historical developments, the tribe of Manasseh came to be dominant over the USA. We have proven this in other talks, and we have articles on the subject on our website. Presently discussing Ephraim. There are numerous proofs that show that Ephraim is to be found amongst the British peoples. One of these proofs was that Ephraim was to precede Manasseh in achieving its self-expression as an Israelite tribal entity, and also the relative importance in different spheres, that Ephraim was to become more prepared to sacrifice himself, to lower himself in order to achieve higher goals. But Ephraim was to rule over other nations. Ephraim was to bring other nations into existence. Ephraim was to become a company of nations. Also, Ephraim represents the aristocratic principle. Ephraim is known as a bull or a young bull, such as John Bull, or as an eagle, an Angli in Hebrew, from the Angles gave their name to England, and other reasons. Present we're discussing one of these aspects, and this aspect is the aristocratic principle. The tribe of Ephraim was known as an aristocratic tribe, as a tribe that for some reason or other believed in aristocracy and held the aristocratic principle, the principle of nobility, as one of its foundational features. And we find this today amongst the British, and almost only amongst the British. In the past it may have been found amongst numerous other nations. Today it is a British feature, a British characteristic. And this was a characteristic of Ephraim in ancient times. It is one of the identifying features of Ephraim, that is nobility. The very name Ephraim, or Ephrati, Ephrati in Hebrew means someone from the tribe of Ephraim, connotes an aristocrat or a noble. Jeremiah said, "Is Ephraim my dear son? Is he a pleasant child? And since I spake against him, I earnestly remember him still. Therefore my bowels are troubled for him. I will surely have mercy upon him, says the Lord." The Midrash, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, says that someone who grew up in a palace was known as an Ephrati, was known as someone from the tribe of Ephraim. In other words, the name for someone from Ephraim and the name for someone who was a noble in ancient Hebrew were one and the same. This word is known as an Ephrati. It means a master and a governor. Rabbi Pinchas says our forefather Jacob, when he passed away, coronated Ephraim with a crown and made him the head of the tribes, the chief of the assembly. The most handsome and exalted of my descendants will be called by his name. That was a blessing, according to the Midrash, that Ephraim was to receive, or that the blessing that Ephraim was to receive from Jacob would be expressed in such a manner. And the Midrash refers to the fact that the very name Ephraim connotes nobility. Manasseh, on the other hand, the term Manasseh that we find to have dominated the USA, in Hebrew means responsible representation. This is a foundational principle of the USA. Ephrati, meaning someone from the tribe of Ephraim, in Hebrew meant a noble, an aristocrat. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, he was from Ephraim, from the tribe of Ephraim. See 1 Kings 11:26, and Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephrathite. Ephrathite, or Ephrati in Hebrew, was Zeradah, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruah, a widow king. Even he lifted up his hand against the king. Jeroboam had been a servant of King Solomon. He rebelled against King Solomon. When Solomon died, Jeroboam returned, and Jeroboam was appointed as a representative of the northern tribes. The northern tribes came to Rehoboam, or Rehoboam in Hebrew. Rehoboam was the successor to Solomon. He was appointed the king over all Israel, And Jeroboam, at the head of the delegation of the other tribes, came to him and they asked Rehoboam to consider their financial stringencies and that he lower their taxes. Rehoboam refused, and consequently the 10 tribes rebelled, and they appointed Jeroboam to be their king. Jeroboam, the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, of the 10 tribes, was from the tribe of Ephraim. A few hundred years later, this kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians. Its inhabitants were taken into exile by the Assyrians, so taken different sections of the Assyrian Empire. We have proven that they were eventually to migrate in different waves and different pathways to the west. And they congregated and they concentrated themselves in Western Europe, in different areas of Western Europe. And that section that had pertained to the tribes of Joseph became prominent in the British Isles. Out of the British Isles came the early settlers of the USA. These early settlers represented specific social elements and social economic elements, and they also represented in a predominant manner, the overwhelming mass of them came from certain areas in the British Isles, and these areas were primarily associated with the tribe of Manasseh. Most of the people of these areas moved out and went to the USA after it was created, whereas those who remained behind, and also those in the other areas from which there was less of an emigration to the USA, to America, belonged to Ephraim, and so the British and the British dominions are Ephraim and have the characteristics of Ephraim. Ephraim means a nation of aristocrats. How did Ephraim get his name? We're told that Joseph, he said, as we see in Genesis 41:52, and the name of the second called he Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful. Hebrew Ephrati, the land of my affliction. Ephrati means to be fruitful. It can also be understood to mean has made me to be powerful. That both meanings are acceptable from the Hebrew, and both meanings are not contradictory to each other. The Hebrew language is such that it could be so intended that both meanings be applicable and both meanings be what gave rise to the name Ephraim. And so we find even in the Hebrew dictionary the name Ephrati, as we may see in the Hebrew dictionary of Ibn Shushan, means either an aristocrat or someone from the tribe of Ephraim. And we can go into this, but this is enough if can be verified also by concordances, that the very name for Ephraim, for someone from Ephraim, was an Ephrati, and this in Hebrew could also mean a noble. And so the tribe of Ephraim, as the Midrash tells us, as the Midrashim tell us, the tribe of Ephraim was known for its belief in holding to the principle of nobility, of aristocracy. And we have identified Ephraim with Britain. And in Britain today there are two classes of people, the commoners and nobility, basically. The nobility are the aristocracy. They have their own house. They have the House of Lords, which is similar to the Senate in the USA. It has certain veto rights, or in the past it did have absolute veto rights. Nowadays it has more limited ones, but still has power. It still is important. To be a lord is still important. It's still very useful in Britain, in British society. The aristocrats look after themselves. They also work. They also do well for themselves and by themselves, and the institution is accepted by the British people. It is worthwhile being a noble in Britain, despite the fact that a good portion of the British commoners, of the ordinary British people, are not snobbish. They don't like aristocrats. They don't like nobility. They are as egalitarian and equalitarian as anyone else, even more so, also very assertively so. But even so, despite this, the English people, the British people, the people of the British Isles have a regard for aristocrats, and in a sense also regard themselves as members of the aristocracy. Only one portion has received titles and the other portion has not. And Arthur Bryant, who was an English author a few decades ago, an English saga 1890 to 1940, he wrote concerning the English working man. He did not take ready to aggregate conceptions of himself. He did not want liberty as a member of a class. He wanted as a man, his fist and his tongue were always quick to assert his independence. Not clearly understanding how he had been swindled out of his birthright, home status and privilege, he was yet aware of the dignity of his descent. He knew himself to be as good as any man and better. The English regard themselves as a nation of disinherited Chiri aristocrats. Everyone was an aristocrat, and this is how the Midrash and the Bible indicates that the tribe of Ephraim from ancient times had regarded himself. Bryant also says the downtrodden wage slave did not think of himself as such, but as the rightful inheritor, as by ancestry he was, of a free tradition of transmitted privilege. He only wanted to get back his own, to be the great gentleman he knew himself to be, enjoying, generous and carefree. And so too, when you meet English people, or you meet someone from Australia and even from Canada and in New Zealand, they are as democratic as the next man, and they take people as they come, as they should do, but they also have a tendency of hierarchy to place a person in the correct ascendancy relative to themselves, even subconsciously, and this is a characteristic of Ephraim. It can be good, can be bad. They may use it in order to help the person they're speaking to, or to be helped by them, or to be overbearing towards them. We would call snobbish towards them. Sometimes in an inoffensive way, sometimes it can be offensive. This is a common characteristic amongst the people of Ephraim, amongst the British and British descendant peoples. Walter Emerson wrote essays. He wrote a book concerning the English, and he also wrote about the British aristocracy. And his book is this chapter 11 in this book is well worth reading all the way through. We're only going to quote a few sentences from this work, just to bring out our point. He says that the frame of society that's aristocratic, the taste of the people is loyal. Goes on concerning the English, the hopes of the commoners take the same direction with the interests of the patricians. Every man who becomes rich buys land and does what he can to fortify the nobility into which he hopes to rise. The taste of the people is conservative. They are proud of the castles and of the language and symbol of chivalry. Even the word lord is the luckiest style that is used in any language to designate a patrician. The superior education and manners of the nobles recommend them to the country. And all nobility in its beginnings was somebody's natural superiority. But the English lords did not call their lands after their own names, but call themselves after their lands, as if the man represented the country that bred him. It has too the advantage of suggesting responsibilities, being responsible. A susceptible man could not wear a name which represented in the strict sense a country or county of England, without hearing in it a challenge to duty and honour. This institution is one step in the progress of society, and every race yields a nobility in some form. And he also points out in the role of nobles are found poets, philosophers, chemists, astronomers, also men of solid virtues and of lofty sentiments. Often they have been the friends and patrons of genius, and learning, especially of the fine arts. And even so, this tradition has continued. The British are Ephraim. They have the principle of nobility, and this principle of nobility is a proof, another proof confirming their descent from Ephraim. And generally, this aristocracy that they do have, it was earned, it was achieved by people in the past of a warrior or a loyal subject had conquered the rights of leadership, or had performed a service to the people, to the nation, or to the king, or to another more powerful liege. Being a noble, usually required military service, leading others, acting with bravery and chivalry, to look upon after those underneath him and treat them with reasonable consideration. But no one did not fulfill all of these requirements. Somehow or other his line would be terminated, and he would be replaced by someone else. This was a law of nature. This was what the British nobility required. It required people to act in a certain way, to achieve a certain standard, to have some modicum, some minimum level of consideration for their subjects, for the others. They did not do that, they would disappear. Their privileges would be taken from them in some way or other at some stage. Their privileges also gave them property, gave them rights in government and other ways, but they had to fulfill it, they had to live up to it. If they did not do so, they would be in trouble, they would not last long. This was a fact of life. Nobles were expected to be manly, considerate, naturally assertive without having to raise their voice, well-mannered, reasonably intellectual, and brave. The principles of nobility permeated society. The middle classes consciously or subconsciously assimilated and imitated nobility values and attitudes. They still do. The ranks of the nobility were in effect open to whoever could climb into them and stay there. You could do it. Anyone could become a noble if he would reach a certain standard, and if he would maintain that standard, and if he would assert himself, he would be accepted at some stage, and usually more sooner rather than later. Also, the common people, despite their egalitarian tendencies, held themselves to have noble qualities and deserved to be treated accordingly. And this is well known. And perhaps we should here recite a few verses from a poem by Rudyard Kipling, The Saxon and Norman, which illustrates how the common English person held himself and the innate dignity that he assumed himself to have, and that he indeed did have, and that he too in his own way was a noble, and that is why he respected and still respects the principle of nobility. Saxon and Norman by Rudyard Kipling. My son, said the Norman baron, I am dying and you will be heir to all the broad acres in England. William gave me for my share when we conquered the Saxon at Hastings. A nice little handful it is, but before you go over to rule it, I want you to understand this. The Saxon is not like us Normans, his manners are not so polite, but he never means anything serious till he talks about justice and right. When he stands like an ox in the furrow, with his sullen set eyes on your own, and grumbles this isn't justice, my son, leave the Saxon alone. And he goes on, and the poem is worth reading in its entirety, and it illustrates a certain truth, a certain historical truth. It might be idealized, it might be exaggerated, but there's some truth in it. The English person, the common English subject, could not be mistreated overduly, because he too considered himself a nobility. He considered himself a natural aristocrat. There were aristocrats with title and there were aristocrats without titles. There was no one who was not an aristocrat. This is what the Midrash says about Ephraim, that all of them were aristocrats. And this is what made England great. This is how the English Empire was built with a handful of people who considered themselves to have been born to greatness. And in a sense they were, and this, as we said, is a proof that Ephraim is to be found amongst the British and British descendants and British offshoots. Thank you very much. This is Yair Davidiy on behalf of Brit-Am movement of the 10 tribes of Israel. I've been talking to you from Jerusalem, the capital of Israel.